Welcome back to the course Life of Christ. We're now in lesson 14, which has to do with the temptations of Jesus, and we'll take this lesson in two parts. First of all, I'd like to set a little bit of background culturally, geographically, and historically, and give you a picture of where this happened and maybe some of the factors that influenced how the Jews especially would understand this story. Right here you see a picture that should look familiar to you. You've seen the area around Jericho before. You see in the bottom left of this picture, the modern city of Jericho, which also includes the ancient tell of Jericho we've seen before. And then between here and Jericho and going kind of southwest, this picture's turned a little bit around, but if you head southwest from here and you go down this long wadi or ravine here, the Wadi Kelt, that's the road to Jericho. So the famous road where the story of the Good Samaritan may have happened was the same road where Jesus would have traveled from Jerusalem to Jericho or back again, especially when he would come from Galilee and go down to Jerusalem for the festivals. He would come down the Jordan Valley and then hit Jericho and then take this road from Jericho on into Jerusalem. And we should say on up to Jerusalem, because it was quite a hike up from this point on. Then if you go a little bit further around that area, you see another view of the Wadi Kelt, a little bit closer. And there's a really neat path that if you ever get a chance, you need to walk this path about 3 miles from Jericho through the Wadi Kelt on its way to Jericho. Then if you go to Jericho itself, we took this picture from near what they call the Mount of Temptations. You see the sign also in Arabic there. And the mount itself is what has traditionally been recognized as the place where Jesus went through the temptations in Matthew 4 with the devil. There's a monastery kind of up here on the hill. There's a restaurant, a cable car that goes up to the restaurant with a great view of the area. Of course, we don't know for certain exactly where the temptations happened, but we know that it was within this desert of Judea here. So if you think about the temptations, just to have a little bit of background, I wonder, especially beginning, what Satan's purpose was in tempting Jesus. Of course, the overall purpose is to get Jesus to sin and to destroy that part of his ministry, and no longer a perfect ministry. But you wonder why he picked these particular temptations out of all the ones he could have used. And I wonder if perhaps he had a conversation similar to that which we see in Job chapters 1 and 2. You remember the story of Job, where in chapter 1 it says that God is on his throne and Satan comes into the presence of God, and God asks him what he's been doing, where he's been going, and he's roaming to and fro throughout the earth. And God asked him, have you noticed my servant Job? There's no one more righteous than him in all of the earth. And Satan says, of course he's going to be righteous. You've given him everything. But if you took away everything from Job, then you'd see that he'd curse you to your face. And so the Lord says, all right, you can test him. You can take away anything that you want from him, but don't touch him. And so Satan goes out and afflicts basically everything that has connections to Job. He takes away his children, 10 children, takes away all of his flocks, much of his wealth along with that. And very few even survive to come bring Job the news. And yet, at the end of that first chapter of Job, we see that Job does not curse God, and he remains faithful, even though he's mourning for his children and mourning what has happened to him. So in chapter 2, it begins with the same scene and Satan coming before the Lord again. And so then the Lord says, have you noticed that my righteous servant Job didn't curse me? And Satan says, well, sure, he wasn't going to curse you because you didn't touch him himself. But if you touch him, maybe even let me hurt him or kill him, then he'll curse you to your face. And so God says, all right, you can lay your hands on him, but don't kill him. And so Satan afflicts Job with terrible boils, some sort of skin disease. We're not exactly sure what it is, but it puts him in tremendous pain. For 7 days, he just sits there in silent suffering, and his friends come and they sit with him in silence. And his wife says to Job, why don't you curse God and die? And he says, I can't do that. You know, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And it says, in all this, Job did not sin in what he said to God. And so then the rest of Job takes place, and the question of, good and evil, and why do bad things happen to good people, a discussion that I know that everyone has thought about at different points. But in connection with this story, I wonder if perhaps something similar might not have happened between Satan and God. Now, we don't know if Job ever found out about that conversation. We don't know if Jesus knew that this was going to happen or the way it was going to happen. But I wonder if Satan had to almost ask God permission to tempt his son. But however that worked, we see that Satan comes, and his strategy is to derail Jesus any way he can. And so we see these three temptations that he selects. One other question that I want you to be thinking about as we go through this story is, what was the purpose of the temptations for Jesus? Obviously, the number one is to resist, to not let Satan have any control or influence over him. But what else might have been the purpose of the temptations as he was in the wilderness for 40 days and nights, as he fasted? What did he do during the 40 days? What did he think about? What did he pray about? Interesting questions. I want you to be chewing on those as we go through this story. So let's go on to the reading, and we're going to take Matthew's version of it, Matthew chapter 4, and we'll read verses 1 through 11 from the NIV. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their splendor. "All this I will give you," he said, "if you will bow down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended him. Now, let's look at a little more background historically about the Jews. The Jews were people of the desert. A lot of their history was spent in the desert. When Abraham came to the land of Canaan, he ended up settling further south on the edge of the desert in the Beersheba region near Hebron as well. And of course, Isaac and Jacob then became people of the desert. When the Jews went into Egypt and then came out of Egypt, they spent 40 years wandering in the desert. And so the desert is actually a large part of the history of the people of Israel. And this word for desert in Hebrew is midbar, M-I-D-B-A-R. And this is the Hebrew word that you see here read from right to left. And literally it means a place of words or place of the mouth. It's connected to the Hebrew word for word or speaking. But the interesting thing about this is that it's got a versatile set of consonants. Now, in the original Hebrew, there were only consonants. People knew what the words were as they read, and so they knew the vowels to put in to be able to speak the words. But if you looked at the original text, before they put the vowel pointing in, it was just consonants. And so the three consonants that are part of this word in Hebrew are D, B, and R. And then depending on the context, then you would know what vowels went with the word. Now what this does, it lets you kind of focus on the similarities of meanings or the connection between meanings depending on the vowels that you put in between these consonants. And so, for example, you have midbar, which the M is actually kind of a preposition in Hebrew. And then you have this DBR. So when you have the I put in and the A, then the word is desert, or as we said, a place of words or the mouth. Now, if you put in an E and an I, the word is debir. Notice the consonants are still the same, but the vowels change. And so you see that word over to the right. And debir means most holy place. Interesting. If you put an O and an E in, and then you have the Hebrew word again on the right, this means pasture. If you put in two A's, it means word or to speak. And then if you put in two E's, and let me go back to the D-A-V-A-R, the V is like a soft B in Hebrew. So in essence, it sounds really similar to the longer B. And then the last one with two E's is deber, which would be pestilence or plague. All right, so again, you have the commonality of the DBR in the middle of these 5 words. And so not always, you have to kind of be careful, but sometimes if you had a set of consonants like this, then you could have different ideas suggested by these words. And in some cases, there's a connection between the different words. So for example, in this case, one scholar has suggested that we could say, if we put all these meanings together, that the desert, the midbar, is the holy place, debir, where God takes his sheep to pasture, dober, to speak to them, davar. And in the case of the Israelites, they actually also suffered plagues in the desert. And so you see these 5 words have kind of overlapping meanings. They're connected in terms of what happened in that place, described by these 5 different words. Now, once again, Hebrew is a little bit complex sometimes and can be confusing. And so we don't want to do this with every set of 3 letters, because that doesn't work in any language. But occasionally, what the Jews could understand by a certain combination of letters could be something like this. I thought that was interesting to see. Now, if you think again about the history of the Jews in the desert, it was often in the desert where God could speak to them most clearly and where they would obey because they knew they had to depend on God. And so you think about, the desert times in your life and what those may have been. Why were you in that desert? What was happening while you were in the desert, or what was not happening? What do you think God was trying to teach you in the desert? Because the desert tends to be a place that strips away a lot of extra things, a lot of comforts, a lot of distractions, a lot of noise, and it leaves you just with yourself and with God in the situation that you're in. And often it seems like God puts us in situations that are desert times for us just to get our attention, so that then we'll listen more before we move back into more of the lowlands, the pasture lands as well. And so the Jews had a number of desert times in their history when it seemed like that God reemphasized, you need to pay attention to me. Here's what I want to do for you, and to show them how he could take care of them in any desert, no matter what their situation was. If you look back in the Old Testament and you see how God and the Israelites interacted in the desert, you see that their very survival depended on him. They weren't going to make it even days without God's blessing and provision for them. You look at Exodus chapter 16, just after they come out of Egypt, they already begin to wonder what's happening and how they're going to have stuff to eat. And God sends manna to them in Exodus 16. Even before they get to the Mount Sinai to receive the law, he sends quail then when they're tired of manna. It says that their clothes didn't wear out for 40 years in the desert. So even provided that blessing. Even the obstacles like rocks, and of course there's millions of rocks in that Sinai desert and the Negev desert where they walk through. But even God would take the rocks and he would bring blessings out of the rocks. Twice for sure of, we know when he brought water out of the rock, like in Exodus chapter 17. Psalm 81:16 even talks about bringing honey from the rock. Some people think that was maybe a miraculous thing, but more likely it's that perhaps bees would make their hives there, and they would store honey in the beehives in the rocks because there's not as many trees in the desert, and so honey in a sense would come from the rock. And then there's an interesting reference in 1 Corinthians 10 that talks about Jesus being the rock that they drank from in the wilderness, and that rock followed them around. And kind of an interesting bit of exegesis there by Paul over in 1 Corinthians 10. But the overall point is that while they're in the desert, God used any and every method to bless them and keep them alive and show them that they needed to depend on Him if they were going to survive. And so, the lesson for us, the same thing. There are enough blessings of God, even in the rocks, even in the desert, to help us go the next step of the way and make it through that desert. And so this whole lesson for the Jews, this background of Jesus going into the desert and being tested in the desert for 40 days really echoed with the Jews, because they were there in the desert. They knew what it's like to find God in the desert, to be tempted in the desert, to be provided for in the desert, and even the number was the same, 40 years, 40 days. And so Jesus, as a Jew, spent this time in the desert at the beginning of his ministry. So if we look back to the question that we proposed earlier on, what were the purposes of Jesus' temptation in the desert? I think that as a Jew then, he would be accustomed to the idea that you go to the desert to listen to God's voice, to tune in to God. You go to the desert to depend on God in every way. And Jesus, as he began his ministry, he wants to show that from the very beginning, he is going to depend on God, that God is going to provide for him and nobody else, nothing else. And then in Hebrews 4:15, it mentions how he's been tempted in every way as we have been, but he was without sin. And so a large part of the purpose of his temptations, I believe, was to show us you can resist temptation. No matter how hard it is, you can resist it with the blessing and the power of God. And so even at the very beginning, really even before his ministry begins, we see certain lessons about how he's going to operate in his ministry. I would imagine he spent a lot of time praying about his ministry, the activities he was going to be involved in, the places he would go. The main idea was he was going to teach about his relationship with God, thinking about the kingdom of God and how to communicate that. I would imagine that was a large part of the 40 days he spent while preparing for the temptation and then later on for his ministry. Then at the very end of the story, it talks about how finally the angels came and attended him. And that's interesting to me. I think the fasting, often we may think made him weaker before the temptation, but perhaps he needed that fasting and prayer to make him stronger to resist temptation. And then notice that after he's tempted, then Satan leaves Jesus alone, but not forever. And so you think about, James 4:7, resist the devil and he will flee from you. This is an example of that. 1 Corinthians 10:13, God won't let you suffer any temptation greater than you're able to bear, or he'll give you a way out of it. And so we see that in Jesus' life, he does this for his own son, and the promise is that he'll do it for us as well. And so God does that, and then the angels came and they provided for him. Now, think about this as the background, and then think about how it's going to apply as we go on into the next section of the class when we talk about each temptation and how Jesus responded to those temptations. We'll see you next time.